Now let's start off in Kenya, where the country's head of state launched a pretty ambitious billion-dollar project to build the country's first standard gauge rail line. Now once complete, if everything goes according to plan, the line will link Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda and South Sudan. China is covering 85% of the construction cost. Kenya is meeting the remainder. The China Road and Bridge Construction Company says the first phase of the line from Mombasa all the way to the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, will be done in 3 years. Here's CCTV's Robert Nigila with more.
This is what Kenya's dilapidated rail network looks like today. Of the country's 2,500-kilometer rail network, just over 1,000 kilometers is still in use. It's been more than 100 years since the British first built this railway, connecting Kenya's coastal city of Mombasa, where we are right now, onto the hinterland and on towards Uganda. Then it took 5 years to build a massive army of porters and workmen from Asia, nailing down the metal, crisscrossing 500 kilometers all the way to what is now the capital city, Nairobi. More than a century later, and Kenya is constructing a new standard gauge rail line, this time around with the help of China. The first phase will cover 500 kilometers from Mombasa to Nairobi at a cost of $2.8 billion.
What we are doing here today will most definitely transform the course of development, not just for Kenya, but for the entire Eastern African region.
It will enhance the growth of our economy single-handedly by between 1.5% and 2% in our mission to ensure that we grow this economy by double digits.
The China Bridge and Road Construction Company undertaking the work says this line will be complete by 2016.
It will be a landmark project both in Kenya and in East Africa.
Phase 2 will see the rail line link up to Uganda and on towards Rwanda. And while the line will run parallel to the existing one, it will be developed for freight and passenger traffic, cutting travel costs and time by half. When completed, the line is expected to open up the region and spur growth within the region's economies. Robert Nagila, CCTV, Mombasa, Kenya.
On to the other end of the continent, South African mobile phone operator MTN is hoping for improved relations between the United States and Iran in order to access almost $500 million stuck in Iran as a consequence of sanctions on that Middle Eastern state. MTN spokesman Nick Kershaw says that the firm has been enabled to repatriate some $450 million since last year. MTN owns 49% of its local unit in Iran, MTN Iran Cell, which provided about 10% of its total revenues in 2012. Under the money held in Iran, $120 million is dividends owed to MTN. The rest is made up of loans that are to be repaid to the South African company. Now, there have been signs of a tentative, if you will, reconciliation between the US and Iran since the June election of President Hassan Rouhani. Recently, the US described 2 days of talks with Iran this month over its nuclear program as the most serious and candid to date. Tehran so far has hinted that it is ready to scale back some of its uranium enrichment program. Now, while the apparent thawing out of relations between Iran and the US may be welcome news, MTN, of course, has other immediate challenges to deal with. On the 27th of November, Turkcell sued MTN in a South African court, seeking $4.2 billion in damages for alleged corrupt acts which it claims MTN executives engaged in order to get the license they have now in Iran. Let's get the latest details on that from CCTV's Nashina Mahmed. She's in Johannesburg for us tonight. Nashina, when news of this suit initially broke, MTN executives dismissed it out of hand and said they didn't have details of it at that point in time. But have they formally responded to the suit now?
Well, good evening to you. MTN is basically maintaining its initial response, saying that, yes, there is no legal merit to the allegations being made against it by Turkcell. Basically, they're saying that the allegations are based on lies and distortions and conspiracies. So they are really sticking to that initial response. They haven't responded yet to court because those papers were just filed by Turkcell in Johannesburg. In terms of their response in court in the United States, well, they moved to have that matter dismissed, and the basis of their argument was really around legalities. that a U.S. court did not have any jurisdiction to hear a matter between two foreign entities. So they were quite successful in that instance, and Turkcell subsequently also dismissed their case against MTN, but they reserved their rights, and we saw that they now have filed a lawsuit against MTN in South Africa, in Johannesburg. MTN still holding on to their response, as I mentioned, that there's no legal merit, but now what they are saying is that they did conduct an external investigation. They actually hired a retired British judge to investigate the matter externally, and they say that the findings of that investigation also points out to there being no no basis for this allegations that are being made against them, and they will fight Turkcell in court when the matter eventually is heard in a high court in South Africa.
Indeed, but let's look at this from Turkcell's perspective. They did, of course, have their case kicked out in the United States on the basis of a technicality, but are there any legal advantages, perhaps, to filing this suit in South Africa, where MTN is incorporated?
Well, for Turkcell, there clearly will be advantages because MTN's head office is based in South Africa. And what legal experts are saying that in their case in the US, they were basically pulling at straws because they based their arguments on laws that dates back to the 18th century. And it makes more sense to actually sue MTN and take the matter up further in the country of their origin, because MTN is a juristic person and the laws governs juristic persons will apply in South Africa. So it will work out to Turkcell's advantage, but just exactly when the matter will be heard, that's another issue altogether, because what experts saying is it could take years before the matter is actually heard in the High Court, because there has to be a lot of documents that has to be filed, hundreds of documents between the two parties concerned, and also documents that the parties have to submit to the High Court before it's eventually heard. What we do know is that MTN is saying they're going to fight it out in court. They're still very confident that there is no evidence to support these allegations being made by Turkcell. And Turkcell, if they can really prove that they do have solid evidence of bribery and corruption against MTN, then they do have a better chance of winning this matter in the High Court. But it will take a very long time before arguments will actually be heard in a High Court in South Africa. But yes, to answer your question again, it is to Turkcell's advantage that justice could be served eventually, because the matter may not be thrown out because of technicalities and legalities on jurisdiction, because now in this matter the court will have jurisdiction to rule either in favor of MTN and Turkcell if indeed it goes through the whole process and no commercial agreement is reached between the two parties prior to it being heard.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for that update. That's CCTV's Navshina Mohammed in Johannesburg, South Africa. Now let's move on to energy matters. Italy's Eni, it aims to drill 140 new wells over the next 4 years as part of a relatively ambitious $28 billion expansion program. And his vice president for exploration, Luca Bertelli, told the Reuters news agency that the company is targeting to acquire some 3 billion barrels of equity resources within that 4-year window. If that goal is achieved, Eni will have access to new resources at an exploration cost of roughly $1.21 per barrel. And Bertelli said the company aims to spend some $7 billion every year to develop a variety of new deepwater projects in Nigeria, Ghana and Mozambique as well. Eni last month cut its production targets to reflect shrinking volumes from Libya and Nigeria, saying it expected outputs to be lower than in 2012. Now, the company's biggest resource currently is Mozambique's Rovuma Basin that has an estimated 80 trillion cubic feet of gas. Let's head over live to London now for a bit more analysis on this story. CCTV's Mariam Bemard is standing by with more. Mariam, in the medium term here, really, what does Eni's outlook for production look like, especially in light of their dependence on output from Nigeria and Libya? Both countries, of course, have had persistent economic and political problems.
Rama, Eni has already actually reduced its output by 50,000 barrels per day because of the instability and disruptions, of course, which have already caused its oil and gas production to fall to an average of under 2 million barrels. Now, Eni, along with other energy multinationals, has been dealing really very much with a series of issues like widespread oil theft and pipeline leakages in the region as well. But let's not forget, Rama, that Eni had actually predicted more than 3% growth in its production this year. Certainly this was a bit of a wake-up call, if you will, and now it's cut back to lower than 2012 output, also off the back of Libya's exports falling to less than 10% of capacity. So the company is now really trying to regain some of those production losses.
Indeed, but let's pull back a bit here. Once the deepwater assets in Mozambique, Ghana and Nigeria do come online as planned, what will Eni's output in Africa look like?
Right now, it's a bit unclear how that $28 billion program will actually work. It will be over a 4-year span, as you said, with average annual growth output in about 3.2%. But Eni is actually looking to increase its exposure in its African fields that already exist, despite the setbacks. It comes at a time when, for example, Mozambique is launching its 5th oil and gas bidding round for next year. This could actually work to Eni's favor, given the company made a major gas discovery in the Ruvuma Basin with an estimated 80 trillion cubic feet of gas in place. That's more than its reserves in Norway, and this is why Eni's taking such a bold step. But more importantly, with Mozambique also building its LNG capabilities with a capacity of about 18 million metric tons, it'll likely become the second largest LNG producer. A lucrative opportunity, Rama, for Eni to get in now and reap the rewards.
Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for that. That's CCTV's Miriam Bemard live in London. Right, a bit of financing news now. The African Development Bank, it has approved $113 million in financing for the multinational Rusumo Power Project. Now, out of that entire figure, $97.3 million will go into hard infrastructure development in the project. Another $16 million will finance part of a Burundian transmission line. Part of the money has been provided by the Nigeria Trust Fund. The Rusumo Falls project, which is based in Rwanda, will increase renewable power generating capacity and access to electricity in Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi as well. Now, the project has two components to it, an 80 megawatt hydropower generation plant and transmission lines and substations as well, just to get that power out of the station and onto the market. Now, construction of the transmission facilities is expected to be done by August 2018. The three countries will then share the power generated from that product equally. Right then, on to matters about money laundering now. Over in West Africa, the Swiss ambassador to Nigeria, Hans-Rudolf Hodel, said that his country is ready to help Nigeria to develop a counter-terror financing strategy. While addressing the International Hotel Group against money laundering, the Swiss ambassador noted that the terrorism threat is quite real and joint efforts are required to cut off cash supply systems for terror groups. The head of Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission said the cash-driven nature of most African economies fueled the movement of enormous volumes of funds across the continent's borders.
As to movement of cash across borders, Nigeria is ranked 7th in the world in the transfers of illicit funds. It is estimated that for 10 years, about $129 billion, or about 20.6 trillion naira, was illicitly transferred out of the country. The sources of these illicit funds are corruption, tax avoidance, tax evasion, illegal mining activities, drugs, human trafficking, etc.
West African borders remain porous, and this has given rise to drug trafficking at an alarming rate, arms trafficking, smuggling of goods, and money laundering. In the Gulf of Guinea, which has since, or almost, replaced the Gulf of Eden in terms of the volatility and the dangers to piracy and all kinds of transnational crimes. Piracy and oil bunkering have also become new sources for laundering funds.
The majority of people living in the Sahel and West Africa do not have access to either safe or nutritious food. In fact, most of them do live in extreme poverty. Those are the sentiments expressed at this year's Sahel and West Africa Week, where delegates attending the event focused on regional food and nutrition. The discussions at the event touched on ways of speeding up the implementation of the harmonized network and the prevention and management of food crises. Now, the meeting comes at a time when the Food and Agriculture Organization reported statistics indicating that between 2010 and 2012, about 234 million people in sub-Saharan Africa do remain undernourished.
We try to convince the international community to reinvest in statistics, because with no statistic you cannot make a good diagnosis and you cannot help people who are facing hunger.
We did not have one single tool. Everybody was just using his own tool to try to do his own analysis. Then it was very difficult to put those analyses together because they are not using the same tool, they are not using the same method. But right now, with a harmonized framework I presented this morning, we are going to use this to implement this across all of 17 West African countries and to have the joint food security analysis to inform better decision makers.
Right then, about a quarter to the top of the hour, we're taking a short break, but there's plenty more coming up. When we come back, we'll tell you what convenience drivers in Mogadishu are now enjoying after 22 years. You certainly don't want to miss that. We'll see you in 30. Let's head over to Somalia now. The country has appointed a temporary central bank governor. That's the third such official in just over a year, designated to head an institution mired in corruption allegations. Prime Minister Abdi Farah Shirdon said that the cabinet had approved the appointment of Bashir Isse Ali as interim governor. He has already served in that post under past governments, however. His appointment comes amid quite a bit of political infighting between the president and the prime minister. In September, Abdul Salam Omer stepped down as governor amid accusations by UN experts that the bank had become, quote, a slush fund for political leaders, with millions of dollars siphoned out of it. The government, however, dismissed those claims. Earlier this month, his successor, Yusura Brar, resigned, complaining she had been pressured to sign off on corrupt deals. And those are claims that the government also denied. Still in Somalia, motorists there have had to make do with roadside petrol vendors for quite a few years now. They literally hawked fuel in plastic cans for the last 22 years. Somalia's capital hasn't had a proper gas station for refilling or even just basic car service for the entire period. But as CCTV's Mohammed Irmogi now reports, efforts to rebuild the city and provide these services, which most of us take for granted, are now back on track.
For the first time in 22 years, motorists enjoy the convenience of gas station service. Drivers in Mogadishu can now fuel up at a filling station, complete with pumps dispensing high-quality fuel. It's easy and convenient. Just fill tank and pay. This has changed the rather risky but traditional handling of fuel in Mogadishu, where motorists relied on roadside vendors selling dirty fuel in jerrycans.
For me, there's no much difference in cost, but what makes me happy is the shift from dirty jerrycan fuel to an organized filling station.
Motorists say fuel at the gas station is cheaper, more organized and cleaner.
The fuel is filtered and clean, which is a big difference for us. Besides, it's even a modern style of fuel service.
This is way easier than roadside petrol in jerrycans. You see, here there's a dispenser that pumps fuel without having to refill the jerrycan first. This is convenient.
Fuel dispensers pump petrol and diesel into vehicles and calibrate the number of liters and cost of fuel transferred to the vehicle. And this is a new thing in Mogadishu. The filling station offers car wash service as well as sells lubricants for motor vehicles. A booming business venture. More gas stations are opening up in the city. For 22 years, this city didn't have basic services such as gas stations. Poor and refined petrol often caused problems for most motorists. And now as the city attracts investments and restores services, motorists too have access to easy, clean fuel. Mohammed Irmogi, CCTV, Mogadishu.
Now, Egypt's aviation sector, it's been deeply affected by the political turmoil, of course, that has rocked that country's capital over the last 3 years. The sector estimates losses over the last 2 years alone at about $580 million. Egypt's aviation minister Adel Abdel-Latif, however, says there are plans to revive the sector and give it a shot in the arm by investing in new airport terminals and changing flight routes to minimize losses and raise income. Here's part of that interview with CCTV's Yasser Hakim.
Your Excellency, how is the aviation sector doing after 2011 in the last 3 years?
The aviation sector in Egypt is suffering due to the low load factor, and there is some countries issued travel advice to prevent the tourists to come to Egypt, and now they again resume the traveling of tourists to come to Egypt, and we provided a lot of incentives. We decreased the departure fees from $20 per passenger to be $8, and also we give an incentive, a discount 60% for the landing and the parking fees in the airports. If there's any new established airline, he can operate a 1 year free of charge to our airports.
There are several investment projects by the aviation sector concerning several terminals and airports in Egypt. Can you give us an idea about these investments?
We have our plan for the expansion of our airports. Nowadays, the number of passengers in Egypt is 27 million passengers a year. So we have a plan to establish a new terminal to increase the capacity of the airports to be 75 million passengers by the year 2020.
Egypt Air has been losing in the last few years due to the instability in the country. What are your plans to control these losses and turn it around?
We reduce the number of flights on some routes which have losses, and also we maneuver with the types of the aircraft to operate small aircraft instead of large aircraft, and also cancel or shut down some routes depending upon the number of passengers, like we shut down the route of Tokyo and Osaka. Also in Peking, we reduced the number of flights from 4 flights per week to be 3 flights per week. Also, we take a decision to stop hiring for at least 5 years, because our labor law, we can't fire any employee, and also we can't reduce or decrease the salary or incentive.
Right then, quick run through the markets now for you. A bit of a mixed bag across Africa, at least for the equity markets that we do keep a very close eye on here for you. Starting, of course, in Nigeria. The all-share index ending the day lower by about 0.2. Over in South Africa, investors in MTN, of course, completely ignoring whatever risks might emerge from the case with Turkcell. Of course, those might emerge later on in a couple of years, but certainly not at the moment. The market's ending the day higher, at least on the all-share index, by about 0.8. The Kenyan 20-share index still pushing on to multi-year highs. 5137.21, the relevant number there, up by about 0.2, and the Egyptian market ending the day lower as well today, down by about 1/3. That's business for you today.